Yo, it's Graham Ledger. It's time to get totally tubular. So chill out. This radical, bodacious rewind starts right now.
Don't you forget about me. And don't you forget about me.
Oh, Christ, look at that. You shot me.
So what? You shot me.
Look at that. Look at my stomach.
You went too far. Because you're my friend, that means you get to kill anybody you want? I mean, what the
Stop talking. It's making me sick.
That looks bad,
That's what I've been telling you.
Now I gotta get you.
Wait. Don't move. Wait a minute. I feel seasick. I think it's time for both of us to quit.
I know.
I seen it coming for some time. Cocaine is no damn good for anybody. The future is grass. Grass, buddy.
The future is grass. So this is, nearing the end of the 1980s. In 1988, it didn't feel like the end of the 80s. It just felt like a continuation of what we were doing. But cocaine, in many people's lives, played a role. It could have been a significant role, it could have been a minor role, but there was a lot of drugs in the 1980s and a lot of cocaine. In this movie, the theme is not really about cocaine, but the movie centers upon drugs, in particular cocaine. You don't see a lot of drugs, you don't see people doing drugs, but that's an underlying theme about this movie, Tequila Sunrise, shot in 1988. So it was a latter portion of the 80s. Grass is the future. Boy, in California, that was certainly prophetic. This movie is kind of about transitions. Transitioning from the early, mid-1980s to the later portion of the 1980s, about to transition into the 90s. It's also about an actor in transition, and I'll get to that in just a moment. But let's go back in time, shall we, to 1988. The average home in 1988 cost $90,000, and the average income was about $25,000. So, if you look at the early 80s and the average income in the late 80s, it didn't shift all that much. But the home prices did shift significantly. Gas was still under $1, 91 cents. In fact, it was cheaper in 1988 than it was in some points of the early 80s. Who were the big groups in 1988? If you put on your thinking cap and you were alive back then, do you remember Guns N' Roses? Of course you remember Guns N' Roses. They're still popular in some circles today. But Robert Palmer. Remember the Robert Palmer videos? Those were classic 1980 MTV, and MTV was still going on in 1988, MTV type videos. In 1988, the first boombox that was a CD player came out. so we had boomboxes making the transition from cassette to CD. And in 1988, a new drug emerged mostly in the inner cities called crack, a derivative of cocaine, but it's the crack cocaine started breaking into American society. But this movie, again, the underlying theme is about cocaine, not crack cocaine. And in fact, it's a love story. Not exactly a Romeo and Juliet love story, but it's pretty darn close. You have Kirk Russell, the big stars here, I've neglected to mention. That clip is not emblematic of the movie. That clip, by the way, is more climactic for the movie, and it involves one of the main actors, of course, Mel Gibson. But you had Mel Gibson, you had Kirk Russell, and you had Michelle Pfeiffer. And it seems as though what the studio was doing here back then, Warner Brothers, was to give some sort of vehicle so these big-name stars, at least two of them were big. Mel Gibson wasn't quite up there with Michelle Pfeiffer and Kirk Russell, but he was gaining significance in Hollywood at that time and making some major films. In 1988, this was several years past Michelle Pfeiffer's huge role in Scarface, which helped define her as a pretty awesome actress. And so I think this was a chance for Warner Brothers to stick a bunch of stars on the screen and see what happens, and see how Mel Gibson performs against two bona fide stars who had a lot more film under their belts in Kirk Russell and Michelle Pfeiffer. So this is a love story. And it's Kirk Russell wants Michelle Pfeiffer. Kirk Russell is a cop. He wants Michelle Pfeiffer. Michelle Pfeiffer's kind of indifferent, but then eventually falls for Kirk Russell. Then she finds out that Kirk Russell is not exactly who she thought he was. And this whole time, Mel Gibson wants Michelle Pfeiffer. So it's two guys going after the same girl. You know, it's the age-old story that's been going on since the dawn of man. And so in the end, it's Kurt Russell who loses Pfeiffer, and Mel Gibson gets her. And there's a point in the movie where Michelle Pfeiffer figures all this out, that Kurt Russell is just kind of using her to get to Mel Gibson, who is the reformed former coke dealer.
Don't you have to get back to your party?
In a minute.
Excuse me. Is there something wrong?
You were asking me about Mr. McCusick. What did you want to know?
I was asking about you, Joanne. I wanted to know why you saw him.
I thought he owed me an explanation.
Did you get it?
Oh, yeah. Would you like to hear it?
I'm not sure.
Mr. McCusick, it seems, has been engaged in his business for purely romantic reasons, while you, it seems, have been engaged in romance for purely business reasons.
I'm not sure I understand that.
A little vague for you?
A little.
Then let me spell it out. You want to f*** your friend. F*** him, not me.
So there's no doubt that Michelle Pfeiffer has the best lines in the movie, like that scene right there. She also tells Kirk Gibson that you're suspicious of any woman who you haven't slept with. So she, in this movie, doesn't sugarcoat it, and goes toe-to-toe with the tough guys. This movie was shot in Manhattan Beach, so it's another movie shot in the LA area, not exclusively Manhattan Beach. But a lot of the movie was shot in Manhattan Beach. You can see the pier, you can see the beach itself. You can see Mel Gibson in his swim trunks on the beach. Not a lot of skin in this movie, but there's some. This movie takes you back to the late 1980s. Again, it's a transitional time, a time when the 80s were kind of growing up, a time when there was still smoking in restaurants. That was still legal in California. Now you will be thrown in jail, or at the very least escorted out. A time when pagers still existed, although 88 was right around the time where cell phones were just starting to make their mark in society, but pagers still existed. And two big stars, that would be Kurt Russell and Michelle Pfeiffer, and one up-and-coming star who was evolving, was growing up, right along with the 1980s, and that's what Tequila Sunrise is all about. It's about the 1980s growing up, and about the early 80s and the mid-80s, and the severe clothing and the severe hair, kind of sunsetting. So we have Tequila Sunrise, and we have the rest of the 80s kind of sunsetting. Decent movie. Not exactly emblematic of the 1980s, but emblematic of the transition from the early 80s to the later half of that decade. If you have a request for 80s movies, music, and more, please email me at grahamledger411@gmail. grahamledger411@gmail.com. grahamledger411@gmail.com. We'll see what we can do to get that movie rewind or musical rewind or what have you from the 1980s Rewound on this here program. I'm Graham Ledger. Later.